You're restless, caught in the night's grip, so let's wander into history's kitchens, where beans, pottage, and garum reigned as staples of survival. Imagine yourself in a dusty Wild West saloon, a smoky medieval tavern, or a Roman triclinium where gritty beans, murky pottage, and pungent garum fueled cowboys, peasants, and emperors through relentless days. Why did these humble dishes define eras? Tonight, we'll uncover their secrets, grit, thrift, and defiance in every bite. So dim the lights, let a fan hum softly, and grab a simple snack to join the feast. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what's the hour? Share this tale with friends, and let's dive into the flavors that fed history's heart, from saloon brawls to Roman revelry, where every meal was a stubborn stand against hunger's shadow. Good night, and may your dreams taste of ancient resilience. Picture yourself as a road-weary cowboy in 1870s Wyoming, your spurs jingling faintly as you nudge open the bat-wing doors of a saloon, the wood creaking like a warning. The air slams into you, not with the romantic sizzle of Hollywood steaks, but with a raw, unfiltered punch. Sweaty leather jackets, stale tobacco clinging to the walls, spilled whiskey pooling on the floor, and the musky tang of horses that haven't seen a stream since the last stampede. You pause, squinting through the smoky haze, as a plinking piano stumbles through a half-forgotten tune, its notes drowned by the clatter of poker chips and the growl of a miner losing his week's wages. Somewhere, a glass shatters, and a barkeep snaps, "Pay up or get out," while swatting flies with a rag that's been filthy since the Pony Express was still running. This isn't a place for delicate senses. It's a saloon where survival trumps sophistication and the faint whiff of something cooking battles valiantly against the chaos. You step deeper into the din, your boots crunching on sawdust strewn to soak up beer, blood, and worse. The saloon is alive, a pulsing beast of rough-hewn tables and rickety chairs where men hunch over their drinks, their faces etched with dust and distrust. You're not here for ambiance. This is no candlelit bistro with linen napkins. Instead, you find a spot at the long counter, its surface scarred from knives, bottles, and broken promises. The crowd is a mix of strangers, a gambler eyeing your coin pouch, a drifter who might save your hide tomorrow, and a cowboy muttering curses into his glass. You catch a fleeting scent of beans simmering in the back, a whisper of hope in this gritty cathedral of vice. But don't be fooled. The saloon's bouquet is a brutal blend, as if the room itself is daring you to stay. You're here for the grub, not the air, the barkeep grumbles, his rag now chasing a particularly stubborn fly across the counter. Somewhere in this chaos, there's a kitchen, or at least a corner playing the part. You glimpse a fire pit glowing with embers, a blackened pot bubbling with something that might be dinner or might be trouble. A grizzled cook, his apron stained with soot and secrets, stirs a stew with a spoon that looks like it's seen more fights than the saloon itself. You strain to hear him over the din as he barks, "Beans or stew?" to a regular who doesn't bother looking up. If you're new in town, eyes lock on you, weighing whether you'll pay in coin or collapse in a whiskey-soaked heap before the plate arrives. There are no menus here, no servers gliding with scripted smiles, just splintered wood, a flickering oil lamp, and the unspoken rule, eat what's given or go hungry. You settle in, the counter hard against your elbows, and realize this is dining stripped to its bones, a ritual born of necessity in a land where the next meal might be a day's ride away. Saloons weren't built for comfort, they were built for endurance. You glance around, noting the sawdust floor, not just a cleaning trick, but a silent witness to spilled drinks and settled scores. The walls, rough with weathered planks, hold stories of bar fights and bad bets, their cracks hiding secrets older than the town itself. You imagine modern diners, used to curated playlists and artisanal menus, recoiling at the rawness of this place. Yet there's a strange beauty in its honesty. Every creak of the floor, every shout across the room, speaks of survival, of men carving out moments of respite in a world of dust and danger. The saloon is a microcosm of the Wild West, where food wasn't just sustenance, but a defiance of the odds, a middle finger to the desert's cruelty. You breathe in the chaos, the smoke, the faint promise of a hot plate, and feel a flicker of respect for those who made do with so little. Here's the shock of it. The saloon's kitchen, if you can call it that, was often just a hole-in-the-wall operation, a fire pit, or a dented stove manned by someone who'd rather be panning for gold. You picture the cook, maybe an ex-miner with a limp and a grudge, tossing beans into a pot with the same care you'd give a sick horse. Yet somehow, this ramshackle setup fed dozens nightly, cowboys, outlaws, dreamers, each plate a small miracle in a land where starvation was as real a threat as a bullet. You marvel at the resilience, the way these men ate questionable stew and laughed through the grit, their stories echoing louder than the piano's off-key wail. As you sit, waiting for your plate, you feel the weight of history, not in grand battles, but in these quiet, stubborn meals that kept the West alive. You're still at that splintered saloon counter, the air thick with smoke and the clatter of tin plates. A grizzled cook slides a steaming heap of pinto beans your way, their earthy scent cutting through the whiskey fumes like a faint promise of survival. In the Wild West, beans weren't just food, they were king, ruling every saloon kitchen from Dodge City to Deadwood, not because they were delicious, mind you, but because they were cheap, tough as nails, and could outlast a gunfight, a stampede, or a cook who'd been sampling the bar's rot gut. Picture yourself staring into that plate, pinto, black, or navy beans. It didn't matter. If they were dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission, they landed in your lap. You scoop a spoonful, the texture soft yet stubborn, flecked with bits of salt pork or maybe a biscuit so stale it could double as a doorstop. This was the fuel of the frontier, the heartbeat of every cowboy, miner, and drifter who hadn't seen a fresh vegetable since they left Missouri. The recipe was as simple as the land was harsh. You can almost see the cook, his apron more soot than cloth, dumping a sack of beans into a blackened pot, the fire beneath it spitting ash like it's got a grudge. Boil them for 6 hours, maybe toss in a chunk of salt pork or a sad, shriveled onion if the saloon's feeling flush. Seasoning? That was a luxury, a pipe dream for men who measured wealth in bullets and bourbon. Whatever dust or herbs blew through the open window was spice enough. You take another bite, the beans heavy on your tongue, and realize flavor wasn't the point. Survival was. These beans powered cattle drives across endless prairies, fueled all-night poker games where men bet their last dime, and kept you upright when the saloon's piano player was off-key and someone's fist was itching for a fight. They were predictable, filling, and as unyielding as the men who ate them, qualities valued more than gold in a world where starvation was a realer threat than any outlaw. But here's the catch, and it's a kicker that could clear a room faster than a drawn pistol. One cowboy eating beans was manageable, but 10 in a packed saloon, a biological disaster waiting to happen. You glance around, noticing the wary looks among the men hunched over their plates, each bite a gamble. Legend has it some bar fights didn't start over spilled whiskey or cheated cards, but from a silent, deadly betrayal near the stove, a whiff so potent it could spark a brawl. You stifle a laugh, chew in carefully, and marvel at how these humble legumes became the unsung heroes of the Wild West. When the chickens hightailed it, the meat turned green, or the cook was down to his last whiskey-soaked brain cell, beans stood firm, unbothered, unburnt, and unchanging. They were the backbone of every saloon, the one constant in a world where nothing else was guaranteed. You hear a tale whispered across the counter, one that's half myth, half truth. A drifter once traded a horse for 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise to leave town forever. You raise an eyebrow, wondering if it's true, but in the Wild West, beans were currency as much as coin. They could be eaten cold on the trail, reheated endlessly in a saloon's dented pot, or bartered when times got lean. You spoon up another bite, the salt pork's briny tang cutting through the monotony, and feel a flicker of respect. These weren't just beans, they were survival in a bowl, a defiance of the desert's cruelty and the cook's indifference. You look at the modern world, with its endless menus and artisanal obsessions, and realize how far we've come. Yet there's something raw and honest about this meal that makes you pause. It's not love you feel for these beans, not by a long shot, but respect, that's a given. Sometimes, in a world as wild as this, respect is enough to keep you going. Imagine yourself now, sitting among those cowboys, your plate scraped clean, the saloon's din wrapping around you like a dusty blanket. Beans weren't glamorous, but they were a lifeline, a small miracle for men who lived on the edge of nowhere. You glance at the cook, his scowl daring you to complain, and decide silence is safer. The beans did their job. They filled you, warmed you, and kept you ready for whatever the frontier threw next, whether it was a cattle drive, a card game, or a showdown at high noon. You lean back, the counter creaking under your weight, and let the thought settle. These beans, gritty and plain, were the pulse of the Wild West, a testament to human grit in a land that offered little mercy. As you push your plate away, you feel a quiet gratitude, not just for the meal, but for the stubborn, unyielding spirit it took to eat it and ride on. You're still hunched over that scarred saloon counter, the air heavy with tobacco and tension, when the cook slides a plate your way. A slab of salt pork sits there, glistening under the flickering oil lamp, its surface speckled with char and promise. In the Wild West, this wasn't bacon, though you wish it were, your mouth watering for something crisp and familiar. Instead, it's pork belly, salted to an inch of its life, smoked in barrels of brine so potent it could preserve a man's regrets. You prod it with your fork, hoping it's been fried to a golden crunch, the kind that makes you forget the bean's relentless monotony. When done right, salt pork is a greasy glory, a burst of salty satisfaction that warms your bones. But when done wrong, and it often is, it's like chewing a saddle strap soaked in axle grease, tough enough to make your jaw beg for mercy. You cut a piece, the knife struggling against the meat's stubborn grain, and consider its place in this dusty world. Salt pork was the Wild West's greasy backbone, a lifeline for cowboys riding trails where fresh food was a distant dream. Packed in barrels, it could survive a thunderstorm, a bar brawl, or 6 months jostling in a saddlebag without losing its grit. You take a tentative bite, the salt hitting your tongue like a slap, and marvel at how this humble slab kept men alive across deserts and prairies. It wasn't just food, it was a testament to endurance, a chunk of defiance against the frontier's hunger. You glance at the modern world with its endless aisles of shrink-wrapped meats and feel a pang of awe for these men who savored something so tough, so unyielding, and called it dinner. The cook, his eyes narrowed as if daring you to complain, used every scrap of this pork. You notice the fat, rendered into a sizzling pool, greasing the skillet for tomorrow's biscuits. The rind, tough as leather, might end up in a stew or tossed to the saloon's scrappy dog, or if you're broke and new in town, slipped onto your plate with a smirk. You chew slowly, dodging a questionable bit that's more gristle than meat, and realize nothing went to waste in a saloon. The fried potatoes, the thickened broth, and the meat itself were diced into beans or gnawed like jerky on long rides. You imagine cowboys packing it like treasure, each salty bite a reminder of home, or at least a reason to keep riding. In a world where your next meal might be 60 miles away, salt pork wasn't just sustenance. It was a promise you'd see another dawn. Here's the shock of it. That glistening slab on your plate might be tinged green, its smell a little too sharp, like it's been hiding in a barrel since the last gold rush. You hesitate, fork hovering, and recall the saloon's unspoken motto. Did it kill the last guy? If not, you eat. You swallow a bite, the salt searing your throat, and wonder how many cowboys choked down worse to stay alive. The truth is, salt pork wasn't always edible by today's standards. Sometimes it was a gamble, a test of grit as much as hunger. Yet it had its fans. You picture a trail-worn drifter, his face weathered like the plains, grinning as he fries a slice over a campfire, the sizzle a small victory against the endless dust. You take another bite, grudgingly impressed, and feel the weight of their resilience settle in your chest. This wasn't elegant dining, and it sure wasn't healthy. You imagine a modern nutritionist fainting at the sodium levels, their clipboard clattering to the floor. But in the Wild West, health was a luxury, and survival was the only currency that mattered. You chew, the pork's greasy tang coating your mouth, and think of the men who carried it through blizzards and shootouts, each bite fueling another step toward nowhere. Salt pork was versatile, slapped on biscuits, stirred into stews, or eaten cold when the fire wouldn't light. You glance at the cook, his apron a map of stains, and realize he was no chef, but a survivor just like you. His skill wasn't in flavor, but in making do, turning a questionable slab into something that kept the saloon's motley crew upright. You push your plate away, the pork half-eaten, and let the saloon's hum wrap around you. The piano plinks, a glass breaks, and someone laughs too loud. You feel a flicker of connection to those cowboys, their lives stitched together by these greasy, stubborn meals. Salt pork wasn't just food, it was a badge of endurance, a greasy middle finger to a world that tried to break you. You compare it to today's polished plates, where every calorie is counted, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern life. Yet there's something raw, almost sacred, about this meat's unapologetic toughness. You nod to the cook, his scowl softening for a moment, and realize that in this dusty saloon, Every bite was a small rebellion, a refusal to let the frontier win. As you lean back, the counter creaking under your weight, you carry a piece of that grit with you, a taste of history that lingers long after the plate is cleared. You're still perched at that weathered saloon counter, the air thick with tobacco and the low hum of a brawl brewing in the corner. The cook, his scowl as permanent as the stains on his apron, slides a steaming bowl your way, its contents sloshing like a murky secret. In the Wild West, stew was the great equalizer, a dish served in every saloon from Tombstone to Cheyenne, no matter how rickety the kitchen or how drunk the cook. You peer into the bowl, catching a whiff of something hearty yet suspicious, a gray-brown slurry that promises warmth but whispers doubt. This isn't the polished chili of today's diners. It's a frontier concoction, a culinary catch-all where anything that didn't crawl away, beef scraps, a stray rabbit, maybe a rattlesnake if it wasn't still hissing, found its way into the pot. You dip your spoon, half expecting to unearth a mystery, and brace for a taste of the Wild West's gritty reality. The beauty of stew, if you can call it that, lies in its ability to hide the evidence. You stir the bowl, watching carrots dissolve into orange smudges and onions vanish like ghosts, while potatoes cling to life with stubborn resilience. The cook started with water, maybe a handful of beans or a sad spud, then tossed in whatever the trail hadn't claimed. If the saloon was lucky, there'd be a chunk of beef from a local rancher. If not, you might find squirrel, jackrabbit, or something the cook wouldn't name. You take a cautious sip, surprised it tastes better than it looks, the salt masking a multitude of sins. Spices were a rare guest. Black pepper meant you were in a fancy joint, and chili powder, if it showed up, was a sinus-clearing surprise. You swallow, wondering what stories this stew could tell, and realize that in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner. Here's the shock of it. One traveler swore he found a bootlace in his bowl, and he wasn't even mad. It was the chewiest part. You chuckle, glancing at your own bowl, half expecting to fish out a spur or a lost poker chip. The stew's charm was its unpredictability. Every saloon had its own version, each pot a gamble between nourishment and nausea. You imagine the cook, his hands as weathered as the plains, stirring this bubbling cauldron with a spoon that's seen more battles than the local sheriff. The pot could feed a dozen men or simmer for 3 days, growing thicker and funkier with each reheat until it took on a personality of its own, like an old friend who's overstayed their welcome. You scoop another spoonful, the warmth spreading through you, and feel a flicker of gratitude for this humble dish that kept cowboys going when the world was all dust and danger. Stew was the saloon's workhorse, a dish that stretched resources to their breaking point. You picture the cook, maybe an ex-outlaw with a limp and a grudge, adding a splash of water to keep the pot going, feeding miners, drifters, and dreamers who'd ridden miles for a hot meal. It wasn't about flavor, but survival, a steaming bowl that warmed hands and hearts after a day wrestling cattle or dodging bullets. You look around the saloon, the faces lit by flickering lamps, and see men hunched over their bowls, their laughter cutting through the haze. This stew, questionable as it was a moment of respite, a shared ritual in a land where trust was scarce and hunger was a constant shadow. You compare it to today's curated menus, where every ingredient is listed, and marvel at the cowboy's grit, eating without asking, trusting the pot to keep them alive. You scrape the bowl, the last bits clinging to your spoon, and feel a connection to those who came before. Stew wasn't just food, it was a defiance of the frontier's cruelty, a stubborn refusal to let scarcity win. You think of modern kitchens with their endless spices and farm to table obsessions and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of today's meals. Yet there's something raw, almost noble about this murky pot. Its contents a mystery, but its purpose clear: to fill bellies, to fuel fights, to keep the West moving. You nod to the cook, his eyes daring you to complain, and decide silence is safer. As you lean back, the saloon's din wrapping around you like a worn blanket, you carry the taste of that stew, a gritty, greasy testament to survival, a bowl that held more than food, but the stubborn spirit of a world that refused to break. You're still at that creaky saloon counter, the air buzzing with the clink of glasses and the low growl of a poker game gone sour. The cook, his hands rough as the Wyoming plains, drops a plate before you, and there it is. A biscuit so golden and steaming, a rare beacon of hope in this dusty den. In the Wild West, biscuits were a fleeting miracle, a warm, flaky promise that could make you forget the gritty beans and questionable stew. You break it open, the crust yielding with a soft crunch, and smear a dollop of molasses, its sticky sweetness a whisper of comfort. But don't get too cozy. Such treasures were rare. More often, you're handed hardtack, the bread's undead cousin, a slab of flour and water baked to outlast a prairie winter. You stare at it, hard as a saloon brawl, and know one wrong bite could send you to the dentist or the undertaker. You dunk the hardtack in your stew, hoping to soften its iron will, and think of the cowboys who gnawed this stuff on endless trails. Hardtack was a soldier's ration, born for sailors and smuggled into the West for one reason: it never spoiled. You wait, the biscuit grudgingly soaking up broth, and recall its nickname: teeth dullers, weevil magnets, the kind of food that fought back. If you're lucky, no critters crawl out. Weevils were just extra protein after all. You bite down, your jaw protesting, and marvel at the grit it took to choke this down. Biscuits, when fresh, were legends, baked in cast iron pans over open flames, their buttery warmth a salve for souls worn thin by dust and danger. But hardtack? It was survival in solid form, a stubborn brick that filled your belly when nothing else could. You chew, or try to, and feel a flicker of respect for the men who made do with such defiance. Then there's the coffee, a black, brooding brew that lands in your tin cup with a slosh and a challenge. You lean in, catching a whiff of burnt dreams and bitter earth, the liquid thick with grounds from water drawn from who knows where. Cowboy coffee wasn't brewed for sipping, it was boiled to wake the dead, or at least a mule. You take a sip, wincing as the grounds grit between your teeth, and feel it jolt you like a kick to the chest. This wasn't your modern latte, frothed with care and topped with foam art. No, this was a frontier brew, ground rough, dumped into a kettle, and boiled until it could strip paint or a man's resolve. You imagine the cook, half drunk on whiskey fumes, tossing in a fistful of beans with the precision of a man throwing dice. The result? A drink that was fuel, punishment, and salvation all at once. Here's the shock of it. Some saloons served coffee so old, reheated so many times, it took on a life of its own, thick as tar and twice as resentful. You sip again, the bitterness coating your tongue, and hear a cowboy's tale. One called it a kick you miss when it's gone, a grudging love for a brew that kept you warm on frigid desert nights. You picture men huddled around campfires, their tin cups steaming, the coffee masking hangovers or the aftertaste of dubious stew. It wasn't just caffeine, it was courage, a liquid lifeline that powered night watches and long rides through nowhere. You compare it to today's endless coffee shops with their syrups and single origin blends and feel a pang of gratitude for the ease of modern mornings. Yet there's something raw, almost noble, about this gritty brew, its stubborn strength a mirror of the men who drank it. You set the cup down, the saloon's din wrapping around you like a worn saddle blanket. Biscuits, hardtack, and coffee weren't gourmet. They were survival, each bite and sip a small rebellion against the frontier's cruelty. You glance at the other men, their faces weathered by sun and sorrow, and see them tear into hardtack or gulp coffee with the same dogged resolve. These weren't just meals, they were acts of endurance, stitching together lives lived on the edge. You think of the modern world, where food is a click away, and feel a quiet awe for the cowboys who found comfort in such stubborn fare. The cook, his scowl daring you to complain, tosses another log on the fire, and you nod in silent respect. As you chew the last of your biscuit or wrestle with the hardtack, you carry a piece of their grit, a taste of a world where every meal was a victory, hard won and fiercely savored. You're still slumped against that scarred saloon counter, the air thick with tobacco and the echo of a piano's off-key wail. Your plate of beans and hardtack sits heavy, but when the meal turns sour, you reach for salvation in a shot glass. The barkeep pours a slug of whiskey, its amber glow catching the lamplight like a promise of oblivion. In the Wild West, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was lunch, medicine, and courage, all swirled into one fiery gulp. You knock it back, the burn searing your throat, and feel the world soften, the saloon's chaos fading to a dull roar. This wasn't aged bourbon from a polished distillery. It was raw, rough, brewed in back rooms or barns, sometimes spiked with tobacco juice or cayenne for extra kick. You wince, tasting the frontier's grit, and realize whiskey was the one thing on the menu that never lied about its sting. Some nights, you'd see a cowboy order his whiskey with a pickled egg bobbing inside, a grim nod to nutrition in a glass. You raise an eyebrow, wondering how hunger drove men to such lengths, but in a saloon, whiskey was a lifeline when the stew turned suspect or the biscuits fought back. It numbed the ache of trail dust, heartbreak, or a bullet graze, a liquid bandage for a life lived on the edge. You imagine modern bars with their curated cocktails and garnish games, and smirk at how tame they seem. Back then, whiskey was social glue, shared to make friends, start fights, or seal apologies after both. You take another sip, the heat spreading, and marvel at its power to blur the line between hunger and hope, a cowboy's truest companion in a world where meals were as unpredictable as the next sunrise. Behind this gritty feast looms the saloon cook, a figure as fearsome as any outlaw. You glance at him, his apron a canvas of grease and soot, stirring a pot with a spoon that's seen more brawls than the bar itself. He's no chef, maybe an ex-miner or drifter, his scowl daring you to complain about the greenish pork or lumpy stew. Here's the shock of it. This man, half hidden in smoke, held more power than the barkeep or sheriff, his ladle a scepter in this kingdom of hunger. You watch him toss a handful of beans into a pot, his movements as rough as the land outside, yet somehow he keeps the saloon fed. A good day brings warm biscuits that make you forget the trail. A bad day delivers scorched slop that tests your grit. You don't dare grumble. His cleaver could clear a room faster than a gunshot. The cook's domain was a battlefield of fire and iron, a dented stove or open pit where miracles and disasters were born. You picture him, sweat beading under a tattered hat, turning scraps into sustenance for men who lived one bad day from starvation. His skill wasn't in flavor, but in survival, a gritty alchemy that fed cowboys, gamblers, and dreamers. You compare his chaos to today's polished kitchens with their recipes and reviews and feel a quiet awe for his stubborn craft. He was no hero, but he was vital, a greasy-handed savior who kept the West moving. You nod to him, his eyes meeting yours for a fleeting moment, and sense the unspoken pact. Eat what's given, or hit the trail. As you down the last of your whiskey, the saloon's hum wrapping you like a worn coat, you carry a piece of that cook's defiance, a taste of a world where every meal was a hard-won victory. You're a weary pilgrim, your cloak sodden from a cold drizzle, as you push open the heavy oak door of a 13th century tavern in the heart of England, or perhaps a muddy French village. The hinges groan like a weary soul, and a wave of warmth greets you, laced with the smoky tang of a roaring hearth, the yeasty bite of fresh brewed ale, and the faint, comforting aroma of bread baking in the ashes. A straw crunches under your boots, strewn across the floor to sop up spilled drinks, muddy footprints, and the occasional mischief of a wandering dog. You squint through the flickering glow of rushlights, catching the hum of voices, peasants swapping gossip, a merchant haggling over wool, a lone knight muttering into his tankard. The tavern is alive, a pulsing refuge from the world's chill, but don't mistake it for cozy. This is no modern pub with polished tables and mood lighting. It's raw, rough, and smells like humanity at its most unfiltered. You weave through the crowd, dodging a serving maid balancing a tray of steaming trenchers, and find a spot at a long, scarred table, its wood worn smooth by years of elbows and spilled ale. You're shoulder to shoulder with strangers, a farmer with dirt-caked hands, a pilgrim clutching a rosary, maybe a thief eyeing your coin purse. The air is thick, not just with smoke, but with stories, laughter, and the occasional curse as someone knocks over a drink. You inhale deeply, catching the scent of roasted mutton battling the damp wool of cloaks hung by the fire. This isn't a place for delicate appetites. It's a medieval tavern where survival meets solace, where a hot meal and a shared bench feel like a small victory against the mud, the cold, and the bandits lurking on the road outside. The tavern's heart is its hearth, a massive stone beast crackling with logs that spit sparks like tiny stars. You watch the flames dance, casting shadows on the wattle and daub walls, their cracks hiding secrets older than the village itself. The cook, likely the tavern keeper's wife, rules this domain, her apron a patchwork of stains, her wooden spoon a scepter of authority. She stirs a cauldron of pottage, its steam curling like a promise, while barking orders to a boy tossing more wood on the fire. You hear no menus recited, no specials of the day, just a gruff, pottage or not, as a trencher lands before you, a hollowed-out slab of bread brimming with stew. You grip your spoon, forks being a distant dream, and realize this is dining stripped to its essence, a ritual of necessity in a world where hunger was as constant as the church bells. Here's the shock of it. The tavern's floor, layered with straw, wasn't just for show. It hid a menagerie of spills, from ale to worse, and sometimes a rat or two scurrying for scraps. You glance down, half expecting to see a beady eye staring back, and chuckle at the thought. This wasn't a place for the squeamish, but it was a lifeline. Taverns were the medieval world's beating pulse, where peasants, pilgrims, and wanderers found warmth and camaraderie after days of plowing fields or trudging pilgrim trails. You look around, the faces lit by firelight, and see stories etched in their lines, tales of harvests won, loves lost, or bandits dodged. The tavern wasn't just a kitchen, it was a sanctuary, a place where the church's fasting rules and the land's harsh rhythms faded, if only for a night. You settle into your seat, the bench creaking under you, and feel a connection to those who filled these tables centuries ago. The tavern's chaos, its smells, its noise, its crowded warmth, was a mirror of medieval life, where survival demanded resilience and a shared trencher. You compare it to today's polished restaurants, with their curated playlists and spotless plates, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern meals. Yet there's something raw, almost sacred about this place, where every bite was a defiance of winter's bite or a bandit's blade. You nod to the serving maid, her eyes sharp as she navigates the crowd, and sense the unspoken pact: eat, drink, and live another day. As the hearth's warmth wraps you like a well-worn cloak, you carry a piece of that medieval grit, a taste of a world where every meal was a hard-won triumph, savored amidst the straw and smoke. You're settled on a creaky bench in this 13th century tavern, the hearth's glow warming your damp cloak as the scent of smoke and ale swirls around you. A serving maid, her apron as battle-worn as a knight's armor, plunks a trencher before you, a hollowed-out slab of rye bread brimming with pottage, a steaming, earthy stew that looks like it's been simmering since the last harvest. In medieval Europe, pottage was the tavern's lifeblood, a dish that fed everyone from mud-caked peasants to weary pilgrims and the occasional lord passing through. You dip your wooden spoon, the broth's warmth seeping into your fingers, and catch a whiff of barley and cabbage, maybe a hint of leek if the cook was feeling generous. This isn't the refined soup of modern menus, but a thick, murky concoction, a culinary catch-all where every scrap of the land, grains, roots, or a lucky bit of mutton, found its home. You take a sip, the taste grounding yet unassuming, and feel the pulse of a world where survival hung on a single bowl. The recipe was as simple as the lives it sustained. You picture the cook, likely the tavern keeper's wife, her hands rough from years at the hearth, tossing barley or oats into a cauldron blackened by countless fires. She'd add whatever the fields offered: turnips, onions, or a wilted cabbage, boiling them until they surrendered into a comforting mush. If the tavern had coin, you might spot a chunk of pork or mutton bobbing in the broth, a rare treasure that made your heart skip. During Lent, when the church's rules stripped meat from the table, you'd find beans or a sliver of salted fish, its flavor more penance than pleasure. You stir the pottage, watching the grains swirl, and realize it was endlessly adaptable. Just add water, reheat, and serve again. It wasn't gourmet, but it was life, a steaming bowl that kept hunger at bay in a world where winter's bite was as fierce as any bandit. Here's the shock of it. Some pottage sat so long, reheated day after day, it developed a personality, growing thicker and funkier until it could stand a spoon upright. You glance at your trencher, half laughing, half wincing, and wonder if this batch has been simmering since last week's market day. The cook, her eyes sharp as she stirs the pot, didn't aim for flavor, but for fullness, crafting a dish that could stretch a single harvest to feed a village. You take another spoonful, the warmth spreading through you, and marvel at how this humble stew bound people together. Taverns were more than kitchens. They were sanctuaries where peasants and travelers shared trenchers, their laughter and stories rising above the hearth's crackle. You feel the weight of their lives, days spent plowing fields or dodging rain, and sense the quiet miracle of this bowl, a defiance of scarcity in a land ruled by seasons and sermons. Pottage was the medieval world's workhorse, as stubborn and reliable as the oxen in the fields. You imagine a tavern packed with faces, farmers, pilgrims, a bard spinning tales for a free meal, each spooning up the same murky stew, their differences softened by the shared act of eating. The trencher, a slab of stale bread, soaks up the broth, and turning soft and edible, a clever trick to stretch every crumb. You compare this to today's endless menus, where every dish is a choice, and feel a pang of gratitude for the ease of modern meals. Yet there's something raw, almost sacred, about Pottage's simplicity, its ability to feed a crowd with whatever the earth gave up. You scoop another bite, the barley's chew grounding you, and think of the cooks who turned scraps into sustenance, their cauldrons a lifeline in a world where hunger was never far away. You scrape the trencher clean, the bread now soggy with broth, and feel a connection to those who filled these benches centuries ago. Pottage wasn't just food, it was a ritual, a warm embrace against the cold, a shared moment that stitched communities together. You glance at the cook, her spoon moving like a conductor's baton, and sense her unspoken power. She wasn't just feeding bellies, but holding back the dark. You think of modern kitchens, with their gadgets and gourmet spices, and marvel at the resilience of those who found comfort in this humble dish. In a world shaped by harvests and holy days, pottage was a small rebellion, a refusal to let scarcity win. As the tavern's hum wraps around you, the hearth's glow fading into the night, you carry a taste of that medieval grit, a bowl that held more than stew, but the stubborn spirit of a people who ate, laughed, and lived on. You're wedged at a long, scarred table in this 13th century tavern, the hearth's glow casting shadows as the smoky air hums with chatter and the clink of tankards. A serving maid, her hands rough as the oak she carries, sets a hunk of dark rye bread before you, its crust as tough as the pilgrims sharing your bench. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food, it was the spine of every meal, the sacred cornerstone that filled bellies, from peasants to lords. You tear into it, the dense, chewy loaf fighting back, its faint grit hinting at millstone dust or a baker's indifference. Wheat was a noble's luxury, so you made do with rye or maslin, a stingy mix of rye and wheat to stretch the harvest. You dip it in pottage, the bread softening under the broth's weight, and taste the earthy pulse of a world where a single loaf could mean survival. The act of breaking bread was holy, a ritual woven into the church's iron grip. You glance at your neighbors, a farmer with dirt-etched hands, a monk muttering prayers, and feel the weight of their unspoken pact. To share a trencher was to share life. Wasting a crumb was a sin, a betrayal of the fields that bled for this loaf. You chew slowly, the rye's sour tang grounding you, and picture the communal ovens where villages baked, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and rising dough. Fresh bread was a fleeting joy, a warm, fleeting miracle that softened the tavern's rough edges. More often, your loaf was a day old, hard as a knight's shield, or worse, nibbled by mice who claimed their share before you did. Yet, even stale, it was a meal, paired with a smear of dripping or a wedge of cheese that tasted of survival. Here's the shock of it. Some loaves were so gritty, they wore down teeth faster than a blacksmith's file, thanks to stone-ground flour or bakers who didn't bother sifting. You wince, feeling the crunch between your molars, and wonder how many peasants paid for their daily bread with a dentist's nightmare. The tavern's bread was no artisan sourdough. It was a workhorse, baked to last, not to impress. You imagine the baker, sweat-soaked by the oven, kneading dough with the same dogged resolve as the farmers who sowed the grain. Bread was more than sustenance. It was a covenant, a promise that the land, however cruel, would provide. You tear another piece, dunking it in the pottage's murky warmth, and feel the tavern's hum bind you to these strangers, their stories rising like steam from shared trenchers. Bread's role went beyond the stomach. It was the medieval world's heartbeat, stitching communities together in a land ruled by seasons and sermons. You picture a village gathered at the tavern, breaking loaves as the church's bells tolled, each bite a defiance of hunger's shadow. The trencher itself, a slab of stale bread doubling as a plate, was a clever trick, soaking up broth and stretching every harvest. You compare this to today's polished bakeries, with their endless varieties and gluten-free options, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern meals. Yet there's a raw beauty in this loaf's stubborn simplicity, its ability to carry a family through winter's grip. You chew, the grit a faint reminder of the earth's toll, and marvel at the resilience of those who lived by bread alone, their lives woven into every tough, sacred bite. You scrape the trencher clean, the bread now soggy with pottage, and sense a connection to those who filled these benches centuries ago. Bread wasn't just food, it was a lifeline, a shared act of survival that held villages together when the world outside was all mud and menace. You glance at the serving maid, her eyes sharp as she navigates the crowd, and feel the unspoken weight of her labor, every loaf a small victory against scarcity. You think of modern kitchens, where bread is a side dish, not a savior, and carry a flicker of awe for the medieval grit that turned flour and water into hope. As the tavern's warmth wraps you like a worn cloak, you taste the spine of their meals, a humble loaf that bore the weight of a world unyielding, yet unbroken, its crust a testament to lives that refuse to crumble. You're nestled at the worn table of this 13th century tavern, the hearth's crackle mingling with the hum of voices and the clink of tankards. A serving maid, her apron dusted with flour and defiance, sets a plate before you, and there it is, a chunk of roasted pork, its smoky fat glistening under the rushlight's flicker. In medieval Europe, meat was no mere meal. It was a crown, a fleeting badge of wealth that set you apart from the pottage-slurping masses. You slice into it, the knife battling the tough grain, and savor the rare salty warmth that floods your mouth. Pork, mutton, or perhaps a rabbit snared by a lucky hunter, these were treasures, reserved for those with coin or a bountiful harvest. You chew slowly, the flavor a stark contrast to the tavern's endless bowls of barley mush, and feel a flicker of pride, as if you've momentarily joined the ranks of lords or merchants passing through. But meat was a fickle guest in these smoky halls. You glance at the farmer beside you, his hands caked with earth, still spooning pottage, and realize how rare this plate is. The tavern's kitchen, a chaotic dance of fire and iron, relied on what the land or hunt provided. A good day might bring pork, smoked to last through winter's grip, or mutton from a shepherd's flock. If a hunter's arrow flew true, you'd find venison or rabbit, their gamey tang a brief escape from the daily grind. You take another bite, the fat coating your tongue, and marvel at the cook's thrift. Nothing went to waste. Bones were simmered into broth, fat dripped into candles or greased the skillet, and even the gristle found its way into tomorrow's stew. You compare this to today's supermarkets, their shelves brimming with choice, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern feasts. Yet there's a raw honor in this meat, a hard-won prize from a world that gave nothing freely. Then there's fish, a staple when the church's fasting rules swept meat from the table. You're handed a sliver of salted cod, its texture rubbery, its smell sharp enough to make your eyes water. During Lent or holy days, fish, cod, herring, or mackerel was the tavern's reluctant hero, preserved in barrels of brine that could outlast a siege. You bite into it, wincing at the chewy toughness, and wonder how many pilgrims choked it down as penance rather than pleasure. The shock of it hits you. Some fish was so pungent it could clear the room faster than a drunken brawl. You laugh softly, imagining a monk grimacing over his plate, and realize fish was less about taste and more about survival, a grudging nod to the church's decrees. Yet even this was a mark of fortune. Fish meant the tavern had connections, maybe a coastal trader or a local stream, and you were luckier than those scraping by on beans alone. The tavern's kitchen was a battlefield, and the cook, often a woman with a tongue sharper than her knife, was its general. You watch her stir a cauldron, her movements as steady as the seasons, turning scraps into sustenance for a motley crowd. Meat and fish were her currency, proof of her skill in a world where hunger was a constant shadow. You think of the effort behind your plate, the farmer's toil, the hunter's patience, the fisherman's briny labor, and feel a surge of respect. These weren't just meals, they were victories, symbols of wealth in a land where most lived on bread and prayer. You compare this to today's endless buffets, where meat is a given, not a gift, and marvel at the resilience of those who savored these rare bites, their lives stitched together by the hearth's fleeting bounty. You scrape your plate clean, the pork's last traces mingling with the trencher's soggy bread, and sense a connection to the souls who filled these benches centuries ago. Meat and fish weren't just food, they were status, a fleeting taste of prosperity in a world of mud and toil. You glance at the cook, her eyes daring you to complain, and nod in silent thanks. The tavern's warmth wraps you like a well-worn cloak, its hum a chorus of survival. You think of modern kitchens, where every meal is a choice, not a conquest, and carry a flicker of awe for the medieval grit that turned a single chop or fish into a triumph. As you lean back, the hearth's glow fading into the night, you taste the weight of their lives, a plate that held more than meat, but the stubborn spirit of a people who ate, laughed, and lived on despite the odds. You're nestled at the creaky table of this 13th century tavern, the hearth's glow warming your bones as the smoky air hums with laughter, and the clink of wooden tankards. A serving maid, her eyes sharp as the knife at her belt, slides a tankard your way, its cloudy contents sloshing with the yeasty tang of ale. In medieval Europe, ale wasn't just a drink, it was spiritual fuel, a liquid lifeline that flowed through every tavern from York to Provence. You take a sip, the faint bitterness of barley and bog myrtle tingling your tongue, and feel the world soften, the day's toil fading like mist. This wasn't the crisp craft beer of today's tap rooms. It was a murky brew, low in alcohol but rich in purpose, drunk by everyone, peasants, monks, even children, because water was often a gamble, and ale was as close to salvation as you'd get in a world of muddy streams and plague. You raise the tankard, its wood worn smooth by countless hands, and marvel at ale's role in this rugged life. Brewed locally, often by the tavern keeper's wife in a shed out back, it was a craft born of necessity. You picture her stirring a bubbling vat, tossing in herbs like heather or yarrow, her hands steady despite the chaos of the tavern. Ale was more than refreshment. It was calories, comfort, and a shield against the chill of a damp night. You sip again, the earthy warmth spreading, and notice the tavern's hum grow louder. Farmers toasting a harvest, pilgrims sharing tales, a bard spinning rhymes for a free pint. The church, ever watchful, blessed ale as a gift from God, yet frowned on drunkenness, a line you suspect many crossed with a wink. You compare this to today's endless coffee shops, where drinks are status, not survival, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern hydration. Wine, though rarer, was the tavern's crown jewel, reserved for merchants or knights with coin to spare. You're lucky tonight. A clay goblet of red wine lands before you, its tart aroma cutting through the ale's haze. You sip, wincing at the sharp, unrefined edge, nothing like the polished vintages of today's cellars. Wine was a traveler's treat, hauled from distant vineyards, its cost a whisper of wealth in a world of barley and bread. You imagine a merchant boasting of Bordeaux or Tuscany, his goblet a badge of status, while peasants stuck to ale's humble embrace. The shock of it hits you. Some tavern goers drank ale so weak it was barely more than flavored water, yet they raised their tankards with the same fervor as lords sipping wine, each toast a defiance of the daily grind. Ale and wine were the tavern's heartbeat, stitching together a motley crowd in a land ruled by seasons and sermons. You picture a winter night, the tavern packed with faces, farmers, weavers, a lone monk, each clutching a tankard, their stories rising like steam. Ale was brewed to last, stored in barrels that could outlive a harsh winter, its herbal tang a nod to local fields. You take another gulp, the brew's faint spice lingering, and feel a connection to those who drank here centuries ago. Wine, when it appeared, was a fleeting luxury, its presence a reminder of the world beyond the village. You compare this to modern bars, with their curated cocktails and neon signs, and marvel at the resilience of those who found joy in these simple brews, their toasts a rebellion against hunger and cold. You drain your tankard, the ale's warmth settling in your chest, and sense the tavern's pulse binding you to its people. These drinks weren't just sustenance, they were rituals, moments of camaraderie that softened the edges of a brutal world. You glance at the serving maid, her hands deft as she refills a nearby tankard, and feel her unspoken role. She wasn't just pouring ale, but fueling spirits. You think of today's endless beverage options, from lattes to artisanal sodas, and carry a flicker of awe for the medieval grit that turned barley into hope. Ale and wine were more than drinks. They were the tavern's soul, a liquid thread weaving through lives lived on the edge. As the hearth's glow fades into the night, you raise an empty tankard, tasting the echo of their defiance, a sip of history that warmed hearts and carried them through another day. You're still tucked into that creaky tavern bench, the hearth's flicker warming the chill in your bones as the hum of voices weaves through the smoky air. A serving maid, her apron a tapestry of flower and fate, sets a small bowl before you, a rare treat. Frumenti, a warm porridge of wheat, milk, and honey, its golden glow a quiet rebellion against the tavern's gritty fare. In medieval Europe, sweets were no grand desserts, no towering cakes or frosted fancies, but humble gifts, fleeting moments of joy in a world of pottage and toil. You spoon up the frumenti, its creamy sweetness melting on your tongue, a whisper of comfort after a day trudging muddy roads. If the tavern's flush, you might find stewed apples or dried berries, maybe spiked with a pinch of costly cinnamon, a spice worth more than your cloak. You savor the warmth, each bite a small miracle, a defiance of the hunger that shadowed every meal. Sweets were rare in these smoky halls, reserved for lucky days or wealthier patrons. You picture a merchant, his purse heavy with coin, grinning as he's handed a plate of honey-drizzled dough, fried crisps over the hearth's embers. Honey was the medieval sugar, a golden treasure hoarded in jars, its sticky sweetness turning even stale bread into something divine. You take another spoonful, the frumenti's soft chew grounding you, and think of the villagers who saved such treats for feast days or a hard-won harvest. The shock of it hits you. Some taverns passed off moldy fruit as dessert, masked with honey's forgiving gloss, and patrons ate it anyway, too grateful to complain. You chuckle, imagining a pilgrim's grimace as he bites into a suspiciously soft pear, and marvel at the resilience it took to find joy in such simple, sometimes suspect delights. The tavern cook, often a woman with a gaze sharper than her knife, was the architect of these small wonders. You watch her by the hearth, her hands deft as she stirs a bubbling cauldron, her apron stained with the ghosts of 100 meals. She's no trained chef, but a force of nature turning scraps into sustenance with a wooden spoon that doubles as a scepter or a weapon. You feel her presence, a mix of grit and grace, as she ladles frumenti or tosses dough into sizzling fat. A good cook could transform a lean harvest into a feast, her sweets a rare gift that softened the tavern's rough edges. A bad one, you wince, recalling tales of pottage that tasted like regret or bread hard enough to break teeth. You don't dare complain. Her scowl could silence a night, and her ladle might send you running. Her kitchen was a battlefield, a chaos of fire, pots, and questionable ingredients, yet she held the tavern together. You imagine her, sweat beading under a worn headscarf, bartering for honey at the market, or coaxing flavor from withered apples. Her skill wasn't in artistry but in survival, feeding peasants, pilgrims, and wanderers who lived one bad day from hunger. You compare her to modern chefs, with their gleaming kitchens and recipe apps, and feel a quiet awe for her stubborn craft. She was the tavern's heart, her sweets a fleeting nod to joy in a world ruled by seasons and sermons. You think of today's endless dessert menus, where sugar is a given, not a gift, and carry a flicker of gratitude for the ease of modern treats. yet there's a raw beauty in her fruity, a testament to a life that found sweetness amid scarcity. You scrape the bowl clean, the last traces of honey lingering on your tongue, and sense a connection to those who warmed these benches centuries ago. Sweets weren't just food, they were hope, a shared moment that stitched communities together in a land of mud and toil. You glance at the cook, her eyes meeting yours for a fleeting second, and nod in silent respect. Her labor, like her frumenty, was a small rebellion, a refusal to let hunger win. As the tavern's hum wraps you like a threadbare blanket, you taste the grit of their lives, a spoonful of sweetness that carried more than flavor, but the stubborn spirit of a people who savored every scrap and lived on. You're reclining on a cushioned couch in a 1st century AD triclinium, the heart of a Roman villa in Pompeii, or perhaps a bustling insula apartment in Rome itself. The air hums with the clink of goblets and the murmur of voices, laced with the heady scent of olive oil, roasted meat, and the sharp tang of garum, Rome's infamous fish sauce. Mosaic walls shimmer under torchlight, their vivid scenes of gods and grapes dancing in the flickering glow. You adjust your toga, or maybe just a rough tunic if you're a commoner, and feel the room's pulse, merchants debating trade routes, poets spinning verses for applause, a senator's laughter cutting through the din. This isn't the dusty chaos of a Wild West saloon or the smoky grit of a medieval tavern. It's a Roman dining hall, a stage where splendor and status collide, where every dish is a performance and every guest a player in the empire's grand theater. You lean back, your elbow propped on a cushion, and take in the scene. The triclinium, named for its 3 couches, arranged in a U shape, is no mere kitchen, but a social crucible where alliances are forged and rivalries simmer. You're surrounded by a motley cast, patricians dripping in gold, freedmen grasping at respectability, and slaves weaving through the crowd, their trays laden with garum-drenched pork or glistening figs. The air is rich, almost overwhelming, with the aroma of herbs and wine, yet there's a shadow beneath the opulence. The slaves' silent steps, their eyes averted, remind you of Rome's brutal hierarchy. You glance at the mosaics, their colors vibrant despite the flickering light, and realize this room is a mirror of the empire, lavish for some, punishing for others, a place where a single meal could proclaim your worth or your servitude. The host, perhaps a wealthy merchant or a minor noble, presides from the central couch, his voice booming over the chatter. You watch him gesture grandly, his rings glinting as he offers you a plate, its contents a testament to his status. In a grand villa, you might dine on peacock or stuffed dormice, exotic dishes meant to dazzle. In a humbler insula, it's simpler fare, porridge or lentils, but still steeped in Rome's bold flavors. You inhale, catching the pungent whiff of garum, a sauce so ubiquitous it's slathered on everything from bread to fruit. The shock of it hits you. Some triclinia served dishes so extravagant, flamingo tongues, sow's udders, that even the gods might raise an eyebrow. You chuckle, imagining a modern foodie's horror at such excess, and marvel at the audacity of a culture that turned dining into a spectacle where every bite was a statement of power or desperation. This wasn't just eating, it was theater, a ritual where Rome's social order played out in every course. You picture the slaves, their movements precise as they serve, their lives tethered to the whims of those reclining. The triclinium was a stage, but not all were actors. Some were props, their labor invisible yet essential. You compare this to today's restaurants, with their egalitarian servers and printed menus, and feel a quiet gratitude for the modern ease of dining, where status is less a matter of life and death. Yet there's a strange allure in this Roman excess, a boldness that turned a meal into a declaration of empire. You sip from a clay goblet, the wine's tart edge softened with water, and sense the weight of a world where every dish was a gamble between wealth and want, between glory and grit. You settle deeper into the couch, the room's hum wrapping you like a silken toga, and feel a connection to those who reclined here centuries ago. The triclinium was more than a dining hall. It was a microcosm of Rome, where food was power, and power was everything. You glance at a slave, his tray steady despite the chaos, and sense the unspoken resilience beneath his silence. The host's laughter rings out, a poet recites a line, and you taste the empire's pulse, lavish, brutal, unapologetic. You think of modern dining, where meals are a choice, not a conquest, and carry a flicker of awe for the Romans, who made every feast a battle won. As the torchlight fades, blending with the night, you carry a piece of their splendor, a taste of a world where every bite was a story, told in the shadow of an empire that burned bright and fell hard. You're reclining on a cushioned couch in a Roman triclinium, the air rich with olive oil, and the distant chant of a poet reciting under torchlight. A slave, his steps silent as a shadow, places a plate before you, piled with a steaming scoop of pulse, a thick wheat porridge that hums with the earthy warmth of the empire's fields. Beside it, a loaf of coarse bread, its crust cracked like the sun-baked Tiber banks, waits for your hands. In ancient Rome, bread and pulses were the foundation of every feast, the unyielding bedrock that fed legionaries, laborers, and even senators when the banquet's dazzle faded. You scoop the pulp, its texture soft yet stubborn, and drizzle it with a splash of garum, Rome's pungent fish sauce, its sharp tang cutting through the grain's simplicity. You tear into the bread, the chew gritty with the mill's rough kiss, and feel the pulse of a civilization that built empires on flour and grit. Pulse was Rome's humble heart, the daily sustenance of the plebs crammed into insula tenements or soldiers marching across Gaul. You picture a family in a smoky apartment, stirring a pot of wheat porridge over a brazier, their hands calloused from toil. The recipe was bare, boiled wheat, maybe barley for the poorest, mixed with water or milk if they were lucky. You taste it, the pulse heavy on your tongue, perhaps brightened with a scatter of olives or a crumbling of cheese, and sense its weight in their lives. It wasn't glamorous, but it was life, a bowl that fueled Rome's endless ambition. You compare it to today's artisan bakeries, their shelves brimming with sourdough and ciabatta, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern meals. Yet there's a raw strength in pulse, a stubborn fuel that powered an empire's rise, from muddy fields to marble halls. Bread, though, was where Rome showed its layers. You break the loaf, its crust flaking under your fingers, and notice its texture, coarse and dark for the commoner, or soft and white as a senator's toga for the elite. Wheat bread, fine and sifted, was a luxury, a status symbol served in villas where patricians reclined. You, perhaps a merchant's guest, make do with a rougher loaf, its grit a reminder of the miller's haste or the baker's thrift. You dip it in garum or olive oil, the flavors melding into something almost divine, and marvel at bread's role in Rome's sprawling machine. It was carried by legions, traded in markets, even tossed to crowds during games, a currency of survival and spectacle. You think of modern grocery aisles, where bread is a choice, not a conquest, and carry a flicker of awe for the Romans, who made every loaf a small victory. The shock of it hits you. Some bread was so coarse, baked with unsifted flour, it could wear down teeth like a gladiator's grindstone. You wince, feeling the crunch between your molars, and imagine plebs chewing through pain to fill their bellies. Bakers in Rome were no artisans. They were survivors, kneading dough in sweltering ovens to feed a city that never slept. You picture them, sweat-soaked and cursing, their hands shaping loaves that carried families through lean winters or fed armies crossing the Alps. Bread and pulses weren't just food, they were the empire's backbone, stitching together a society of haves and have-nots. You dip another piece, the garum's salt waking your senses, and feel the weight of their lives, each bite a defiance of hunger, a testament to a world that demanded resilience to thrive. You chew slowly, the pulse and bread grounding you, and sense a connection to those who ate this fare centuries ago. In cramped insulae or lavish villas, these staples were a shared thread, binding patricians and plebs in a common act of survival. You glance at the slave, his tray steady as he serves, and feel the unspoken cost of this feast. Laborers who toiled in fields, slaves who carried Rome's weight on their backs. The triclinium's splendor fades for a moment, revealing the grit beneath its gloss. You compare this to today's fast food, where calories are cheap and choice is king, and marvel at the Romans' tenacity, turning grain into glory. As the torchlight flickers, blending with the night, you taste the foundation of their feasts, a humble bowl and loaf that carried more than sustenance, but the stubborn spirit of an empire that ate, fought, and lived on, unbowed by scarcity or strife. You're reclining on a plush couch in a Roman triclinium, the air thick with the clink of goblets and the murmur of a poet's verses under the torchlight's dance. A slave, his steps silent as a shadow, sets a plate before you, its contents glistening with a glossy sheen, a slab of roasted pork drenched in garum, Rome's infamous fish sauce, its pungent aroma hitting you like a salty wave. In ancient Rome, garum was the heartbeat of every feast, a liquid essence that defined the empire's cuisine, slathered on everything from meat to humble lentils. You take a cautious bite, the pork's smoky richness mingling with garum's briny tang, a flavor so bold it feels like Rome itself is shouting on your tongue. This wasn't the delicate fare of modern kitchens. It was a culinary conquest, a taste that carried the weight of an empire's ambition from the crowded insulae to the marble villas of the elite. Garum was Rome's secret weapon, a fermented brew of fish guts, salt, and thyme, left to stew in the sun until it became a potent elixir. You inhale its sharp, almost offensive scent and marvel at its ubiquity, sprinkled on pork, drizzled over cabbage, even dashed into fruit for the boldest hosts. You picture fish markets along the Tiber, barrels of anchovies or mackerel rotting into liquid gold, a process so foul it was banished to the city's edges. Yet this was Rome's ketchup, its soy sauce, its everything, a flavor that bound plebs and patricians in a shared obsession. You chew the pork, its texture tender from a skilled cook, and feel the garum's umami depth, a strange alchemy that turns simple meat into a dish fit for emperors. You compare it to today's condiments, neatly bottled and labeled, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern flavors. Yet there's a wild grandeur in Garum's audacity, a sauce that dared to be unforgettable. The main courses, though, were where Rome flexed its might. You glance at your plate, the pork joined by a humble serving of lentils, or perhaps a fish baked with herbs. In a modest triclinium, this is your feast: pork, chicken, or mullet, hearty but grounded, the kind of meal that fueled merchants and soldiers. But in a senator's villa, the dishes turn extravagant: roasted boar stuffed with figs, dormice glazed with honey, or even peacock, its feathers a spectacle before its flesh hit the table. You imagine a patrician host, his toga gleaming, boasting of his cook's skill as slaves parade these delicacies. The shock of it hits you. Some feasts featured ostrich or flamingo tongues, dishes so decadent they'd make a modern chef blanch. You chuckle, picturing a foodie's horror at such excess, and marvel at Rome's ability to turn dining into a theater of power, where every bite was a declaration of status or survival. These dishes weren't just food, they were Rome's soul, a mirror of its stratified world. You picture the cooks, often slaves, toiling in sweltering kitchens, their hands deft as they balanced garum's intensity with herbs like dill or coriander. Their skill was a quiet rebellion, turning market scraps into feasts that dazzled or sustained. You take another bite, the pork's fat melting, and feel the empire's pulse, lavish for some, lean for others, but always bold. The plebs in their cramped insulic might savor a simple fish, while patricians gorged on exotica, yet garum united them, a salty thread weaving through every table. You compare this to today's global cuisines, where flavors are a click away and carry a flicker of awe for the Romans, who made every meal a conquest, their plates a battlefield of ambition and necessity. You savor the last bite, the garum's aftertaste, lingering like a memory, and sense a connection to those who reclined here centuries ago. The triclinium was more than a dining hall. It was the stage where Rome's dreams and divisions played out, each dish a story of wealth or want. You glance at the slave, his tray steady despite the chaos, and feel the unspoken weight of his labor, the grit behind the glamour. You think of modern dining, with its clean plates and egalitarian service, and marvel at the resilience of those who ate in Rome's shadow, their meals a defiance of scarcity or servitude. As the torchlight fades, blending with the night, you taste the essence of their feasts, a plate that carries more than flavor, but the stubborn spirit of an empire that ate boldly, loved fiercely, and lived unbowed, its legacy lingering in every salty, audacious bite. You're reclining on a silken couch in a Roman triclinium, the air alive with the clink of goblets and the soft cadence of a poet weaving tales under the torchlight's glow. A slave, his movements as fluid as the Tiber, hands you a clay goblet brimming with wine, its tart aroma curling through the haze of olive oil and garum. In ancient Rome, wine was no mere drink. It was the essence of the feast, the liquid soul that fueled the empire's revelry, from humble insulae to sprawling villas. You sip, the diluted red sharp on your tongue, softened with water as Roman custom demands, and feel the room's pulse quicken, merchants debating, senators laughing, a freedman's voice rising in bold argument. This wasn't the polished vintage of today's cellars. It was raw, earthy, a taste of Rome's ambition that carried you from the battlefield to the banquet with every sip. Wine was Rome's lifeblood, flowing through every triclinium, whether in a cramped tenement or a patrician's palace. You picture vintners in sun-drenched vineyards, their hands stained purple as they pressed grapes for cheap Posca, or the fabled Falernian, a nectar so prized it was said to burn like fire. You take another sip, the wine's tang mingling with the feast's flavors, and marvel at its role in Roman life. Diluted to stretch the supply or to temper drunkenness, it was drunk all day by soldiers, scribes, even slaves when the master was generous. You imagine a legionary toasting a victory, his goblet raised, or a plebe savoring a rare cup in a smoky insula. You compare this to today's curated wine lists, with their tasting notes and pairings, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern indulgences. Yet there's a bold grandeur in Rome's wine, a liquid thread that wove through every class and conquest. Honey, though, was the feast's sweet crown, a golden elixir that turned simple dishes into divine offerings. You're handed a small dish of honey-drizzled figs, their sticky sweetness bursting on your tongue, a fleeting joy that softens the triclinium's intensity. Honey was Rome's sugar, hoarded in clay jars, its value rivaling spices from distant lands. You picture cooks stirring vats of mulsum, a honey-sweetened wine, its warmth a favorite at the feast's start, or drizzling honey over pastries baked with nuts and fruit. You taste the figs, their richness a stark contrast to the pulsing porridge of the poor, and feel the weight of Rome's divided world, honey for the elite, crumbs for the rest. The shock of it hits you. Some hosts served honey so lavishly, pouring it over meat or bread, that it felt like a taunt to the starving outside the villa's gates. You chuckle, imagining a modern dessert chef's horror at such excess, and marvel at Rome's audacity to sweeten an empire with such reckless glee. These were no mere indulgences. Wine and honey were the triclinium's heartbeat, fueling debates, dreams, and displays of power. You imagine a banquet stretching into the night, goblets refilled as philosophers argued and poets sang, each sip a spark in Rome's relentless fire. The slaves, their trays steady despite the chaos, poured wine with practiced grace, their labor invisible yet essential. You sip again, the mulsum's sweetness lingering, and sense the empire's pulse, lavish for some, lean for others, but always vibrant. You compare this to today's craft cocktails and dessert menus, where sweetness is a choice, not a conquest, and carry a flicker of awe for the Romans who made every feast a stage, their drinks a declaration of triumph or survival. You drain your goblet, the wine's warmth settling in your chest, and feel a connection to those who reclined here centuries ago. Wine and honey weren't just sustenance, they were rituals, moments of joy that softened the edges of a brutal world. You glance at a slave, his eyes averted as he refills a nearby cup, and sense the unspoken cost of this splendor, the labor that fueled Rome's feasts. You think of modern dining, with its endless options and egalitarian service, and marvel at the resilience of those who drank in Rome's shadow, their toasts a defiance of want or servitude. As the torchlight fades, blending with the night, you taste the essence of their feasts, a goblet that carries more than flavor, but the stubborn spirit of an empire that drank deeply, loved fiercely, and lived unbowed, its legacy lingering in every tart, sweet sip. You're reclining on a cushioned couch in a Roman triclinium, the air thick with the clink of goblets and the fading echoes of a poet's verse, as torchlight dances across mosaic walls. A slave, his movements as graceful as a whisper, sets a small clay dish before you, brimming with fresh figs, their purple skins glistening with a drizzle of honey. In ancient Rome, desserts were no lavish cakes or frosted confections, but simple, divine gifts that capped the feast's grandeur. You bite into a fig, its sticky sweetness bursting like a summer's promise, and feel the triclinium's hum soften, the night's revelry pausing for this fleeting moment of joy. These weren't everyday treats. Figs, grapes, or honey-soaked pastries were treasures, reserved for those with coin or a host eager to flaunt wealth. You savor the honey's golden tang, a rare luxury in a world where sweetness was as precious as spice, and sense the empire's opulence in every delicate bite. Desserts were Rome's quiet boast, a nod to indulgence in a land of conquest and grit. You picture a wealthy host, his toga gleaming, offering dates stuffed with nuts or cakes baked with honey and sesame, their aroma mingling with the feast's garum heavy haze. In humbler homes, you might find only a handful of grapes or a pear, softened by the sun, but even these were a triumph, a taste of abundance in a city where hunger prowled the insula's shadows. You chew slowly, the fig's seeds crunching softly, and marvel at the labor behind this dish, farmers tending orchards, traders hauling fruit across seas, all for a moment's delight. You compare this to today's dessert menus, brimming with ice cream and chocolate, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern sweets. Yet there's a raw elegance in Rome's simplicity, a dessert that spoke of wealth without waste. The shock of it hits you. Some hosts served desserts so decadent, think honey-drenched dormice or fruit laced with rare saffron, that they bordered on absurdity, a flaunting of excess that could make a modern pastry chef wince. You chuckle, imagining a patrician popping a honeyed dormouse like candy, while plebs outside scraped by on Peel's porridge. These treats weren't just food, they were power, a way to dazzle guests or remind slaves of their place. You glance at the servant who brought your figs, his eyes lowered, his tray steady despite the banquet's chaos. Slaves were the triclinium's silent backbone, their labor as essential as the garum that flavored every dish. You picture them, trained to serve with precision, weaving through the crowd with trays of delicacies, their lives tethered to the whims of those reclining. Their skill was a quiet defiance, a craft honed in the shadows of Rome's splendor. These servants, often invisible, were the feast's unsung heroes. You imagine a young slave, his hands calloused from kitchen work, slicing fruit or stirring honey into pastries, his movements a performance as much as the poet's verses. Some were trained to entertain, juggling, dancing, or presenting dishes with flair, yet their lives were a stark contrast to the triclinium's dazzle. You feel a pang watching him refill a goblet, his face a mask of duty, and sense the weight of Rome's hierarchy. The host might boast of his wealth, but the slave's labor made it real, turning raw ingredients into feasts that defined an empire. You compare this to today's restaurants, where servers share tips and banter freely, and marvel at the resilience of those who served in silence, their work a foundation for Rome's grandeur. You finish the figs, the honey's sweetness lingering like a memory, and feel a connection to those who reclined here centuries ago. Desserts were more than a sweet end. They were a fleeting escape, a moment of joy in a world of conquest and servitude. You think of the slaves, their trays steady as they navigated the triclinium's chaos, and carry a flicker of awe for their grit, their labor the unseen pulse of every feast. You compare modern dining, with its casual service and endless dessert carts, to this stratified world and feel gratitude for the ease of today's meals. Yet there's a haunting beauty in Rome's desserts, in the figs and honey that crowned a night of revelry. As the torchlight fades, blending with the night, you taste the finale of their feasts, a dish that carried more than sweetness, but the stubborn spirit of an empire that dined boldly, loved fiercely, and lived on, its legacy etched in every delicate, defiant bite. You're reclining on a silken couch in a Roman triclinium, the torchlight casting shadows across mosaic walls as the air hums with the clink of goblets and a poet's murmured verses. A slave, his steps as silent as a specter, sets a plate before you, roasted pork glistening with garum, perhaps a plump fig drizzled with honey. You're a guest in a wealthy villa, or maybe a cramped insula apartment, and the meal before you tells a story not just of flavor, but of Rome's brutal divide. In the 1st century AD, the triclinium was more than a dining hall. It was a stage where the empire's class chasm played out, where every dish screamed status or whispered want. You take a bite, the pork's smoky richness bursting, and feel the weight of a world where a single meal could crown you king or mark you as a nobody, where the line between patrician and pleb was as sharp as a gladiator's blade. In a senator's villa, you're surrounded by opulence, marble floors, silk cushions, the air thick with the scent of peacock roasted whole or dormice glazed with honey. You picture a patrician host, his toga gleaming like polished ambition, boasting of exotic imports, ostrich from Africa, flamingo tongues plucked for their rarity. The table groans under the weight of such excess, each dish a declaration of power, a taunt to those outside the villa's gates. You sip mulsum, honey-sweetened wine, its warmth spreading, and marvel at the audacity of feasts that stretched into dawn, where guests gorged on sow's udders or fish flown from distant seas. The shock of it hits you. Some hosts serve dishes so decadent, think brains of songbirds or heels of camels, that even the gods might gag at the extravagance. You chuckle, imagining a modern chef's horror at such culinary bravado, and sense the triclinium's pulse, a theater where wealth was not just tasted, but flaunted. Yet step into an insula, the crowded tenements where Rome's plebs dwelled, and the triclinium shrinks to a smoky corner, a single brazier casting light over a wobbly table. You're now a laborer, your tunic patched, your meal a humble scoop of pulse porridge, maybe a scrap of fish or lentils doused with cheap garum. You scoop the pulp, its texture soft but heavy, and feel the sting of a life where meat was a dream, and honey a whispered legend. The air here is thick, not with opulence, but with the sweat of too many bodies, the faint reek of shared latrines seeping through cracked walls. You compare this to the villa's splendor, where slaves paraded platters of exotica, and feel the chasm. Patricians feasted on spectacle, while plebs scraped by on survival. You take a bite, the garum's salt grounding you, and carry a flicker of awe for the resilience of those who made do with so little, their meals a quiet defiance of want. The slaves, ever present yet invisible, were the triclinium's silent scaffolding. You watch one glide past, his tray laden with figs or wine, his eyes fixed on the floor to avoid a master's wrath. These men and women, often chained to their roles, were the engine of every feast, their hands shaping Rome's grandeur from the shadows. You picture them in the villa's kitchen, sweating over fires to roast boar or stuffed dormice, their labor as precise as a legion's march. In the insula, they were neighbors, perhaps, sharing a bowl of pulses with the family they served, their lives tethered to the same scarcity. You sense their grit, their silent rebellion in serving flawlessly despite their chains, and feel a pang of empathy. You compare their toil to today's waitstaff, free to banter and share tips, and marvel at the strength it took to carry Rome's feasts on broken backs. This class divide wasn't just a meal, it was Rome's soul, a mirror of an empire built on conquest and contrast. You imagine a patrician, his laughter ringing as he toasts with Falernian, while a pleb in an insula savors a rare olive, both bound by Garum's salty thread but worlds apart. The triclinium was a battlefield where status was served alongside every dish, where a peacock's plume or a bowl of pools told your place in the empire's hierarchy. You think of modern dining, where restaurants welcome all with printed menus and equal service, and feel gratitude for the ease of today's tables, where wealth is less a matter of life and death. Yet there's a haunting power in Rome's feasts, a boldness that turned every meal into a declaration, whether of dominance or endurance. You finish your plate, the pork's richness or pulse's simplicity lingering, and feel a connection to those who dined here centuries ago. The triclinium was a stage, its actors ranging from emperors to slaves, each playing their part in Rome's relentless drama. You glance at the slave, his tray steady as he weaves through the crowd, and sense the unspoken cost of this splendor, the labor that fueled an empire's appetite. You think of today's egalitarian eateries, where no one dines on flamingo tongues, and carry a flicker of awe for the Romans who navigated this divide, their meals a testament to ambition or survival. As the torchlight fades, blending with the night, you taste the weight of their world, a feast that carried more than flavor, but the stubborn spirit of a people who dined boldly, fought fiercely, and lived on, their legacy etched in every opulent, gritty bite. You're lingering at the edge of this historical journey, the echoes of a Wild West saloon, a medieval tavern, and a Roman triclinium still humming in your mind. Picture yourself one last time, at a scarred saloon counter, a tin plate of beans steaming before you, the whiskey's burn a fleeting comfort, or wedged at a tavern's creaky table, pottage warming your hands as the hearth crackles, or reclining in a triclinium, the sharp tang of garum lingering on your tongue. These meals, from gritty cowboy fare to Rome's lavish feasts, weren't just food, they were lifelines, small rebellions against worlds of dust, toil, and conquest. You pause, the flavors of beans, rye bread, or honeyed figs fading, and wonder. Could you stomach the Wild West's greasy pork, the tavern's funky stew, or Rome's fishy excess? Your modern palate, spoiled by curated menus and spotless kitchens, might recoil, but for the cowboys, peasants, and Romans who ate these dishes, every bite was a victory, a defiant toast to survival. In the Wild West, food was fuel for a relentless frontier. You imagine a cowboy, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, scraping a plate of beans, his laughter cutting through the saloon's haze. The meals, tough, greasy, often questionable, kept him riding through deserts and gunfights, each spoonful a middle finger to starvation's shadow. You shift to the medieval tavern, where pottage and rye bread bound peasants and pilgrims in a shared struggle, their trenchers a testament to resilience in a land ruled by harvests and holy days. The ale, cloudy and yeasty, was their courage, a liquid embrace that softened the cold. And in Rome's triclinium, the divide was stark. Plebs slurped pulls in smoky insulae, while patricians gorged on peacock, yet Garum's salty thread wove them together, a flavor of empire that spoke of ambition and endurance. You compare these to today's endless choices, from fast food to fine dining, and feel a quiet gratitude for the ease of modern meals, where hunger is a choice, not a foe. The shock of it lies in the contrast. These worlds, so different, were united by the act of eating, a ritual that stitched lives together across time. You picture a saloon cook, his scowl daring complaints, or a tavern maid, her ladle a scepter, or a Roman slave, his tray steady amid opulence. Their labor, gritty, unseen, essential, turned scraps into sustenance, feeding not just bodies, but spirits. You think of the cowboys who traded horses for beans, the peasants who broke bread as a sacred act, the Romans who dined as if defying the gods. Their meals were more than nourishment. They were stories, moments of camaraderie that held back the dark. You marvel at their grit, their ability to find joy in a bowl of mush or a goblet of tart wine, and carry a flicker of awe for their stubborn will to live on, unbowed by scarcity or strife. As you linger in these fading scenes, the saloon's piano, the tavern's hearth, and the triclinium's torchlight blending into the night, you feel a connection to those who ate, laughed, and survived. These weren't glamorous feasts, but hard-won triumphs, each bite a defiance of a world that offered little mercy. You compare their tables to yours, where food is a click away, and sense a deeper gratitude, not just for the meal, but for the ease of a life where survival isn't a daily gamble. Yet there's a raw beauty in their grit, a reminder that every plate, however humble, was a story of resilience. So raise a glass, whiskey, ale, or wine, and toast to those dusty cowboys, weary peasants, and bold Romans, their meals a testament to a spirit that refused to break. Before you drift off, share a piece of your journey in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what dish from these eras would you dare to try? Maybe pass this tale to a friend. Let them taste the history too. As the night wraps you like a well-worn cloak, carry the echo of those meals, a flavor of survival that lingers across centuries. Good night, and may your dreams be as hearty as a bowl of pottage, as bold as a shot of whiskey, and as rich as a Roman feast.